The Beatles' 1966 world tour was a living nightmare. They'd fled Manila fearing for their lives, been met with an anti-Beatles backlash with public burnings of memorabilia in the States, and faced crazed fans at Candlestick Park. They were now done with touring. The events at Candlestick Park had been the last straw. Back in the UK, George is enraged. He's done with touring and he's done with the Beatles. He declares he's leaving the band. Brian Epstein, their manager, frantically reassures him there will be no more touring. On this condition, he agrees to stay in the Beatles. The group say nothing publicly though. Brian Epstein insists they keep it quiet for now. He holds out hope they'll change their minds. Following their final show, the group had took a break from each other for 3 months. When they reunited, they looked like completely different people. They'd embraced the hippie fashion, now dressed in colourful clothes, and they all sported facial hair. At this point, Lennon was using drugs heavily. He'd lost a lot of weight, and he worried about the future of himself and the Beatles. Paul, during their 3-month separation, had taken LSD for the first time. One of the reasons, possibly, is that he felt it would bring him closer to John. John in turn has took an interest in the avant-garde art scene Paul frequents, and George has been spending more and more time in India attempting to master the complicated sitar. Now, for the first time recording an album, there is no deadline for new music. They could and would spend as much time as needed to get a song just how they wanted it. The release of Pet Sounds, though it had been a financial disappointment for the Beach Boys, revolutionised pop music. Every song written to form one complete thought, the use of strange instruments to evoke emotions, the complex vocal arrangements, the fact it had all been constructed by one man. It pushed the Beatles to strive for perfection in their own compositions. The sessions will see a usually impatient John spend hours on tracks and accidentally take LSD during a song. George will be so disinterested in the album, he will learn to play chess during the sessions. He will later say his heart was in India during the whole recording of Pepper. And Paul will spend hours of overtime late into the night at Abbey Road Studios working on the perfect sound. This is the story of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. On the 24th of November, the Beatles returned to the studio to start their next album. In the control room in Studio 2, John explains to George Martin they're no longer touring, so they don't plan on recording songs that will be played live. Paul interjects, adding they can't be heard over the screaming fans and their music is becoming too complicated to play live anyway. George Martin looks at them both as if they're insane. The concept of recording songs that won't be played live is too much for him to conceive of. Paul envisions the album will be, in his words, a bit of Ravi Shankar, a bit of Pet Sounds, a bit of The Doors. In truth, the Beatles didn't know what they wanted. All they knew was they wanted different sounds. After George Martin takes in what they've just explained, they stand around the mixing desk at Abbey Road's control room frustrated. After a few minutes of silence, George blurts out, "Bloody Yanks." George is referring to the incident at Candlestick Park. John then interrupts him saying, "What are you on about? I was the one in the firing line, not you." George then replies, "Well, I wasn't the one who was daft enough to compare us to Jesus." Lennon looks away annoyed. The subject of the Jesus remarks depresses him. The conversation then turns to the nightmare they had in the Philippines. They'd been forced to flee the country due to a supposed snub. While attempting to leave, they'd all been attacked. Even their assistant and ex-bouncer Mal Evans had been roughed up. George then changed the conversation to a recent trip to India. Despite his months spent in the hot climate, he still looks as pale as ever. At this point, George Martin moves things forward, declaring, "Right then, let's get to work. What have you got for me?" Paul goes to say something to George, but John shouts over him, "I've got a good one for a starter." Almost every first session for an album, the Beatles start with one of John's songs. John walks down the steps to Studio 2 and begins strumming out a song on acoustic guitar. The three Beatles and George Martin sit listening to John sing about a mythical place named Strawberry Fields. It was, in fact, a place in Liverpool John played as a child. He'd worried about corporal punishment in those days, which is where the line "there's nothing to get hung about" came from. The song was like Lennon recounting his youth from some LSD haze. The engineers Phil McDonald and Geoff Emerick listen in through the control room. John sings so quietly he's barely audible on the microphones placed around the room. Emerick raises the faders almost as loud as they will go so John is audible. To everyone, it's clear the song is a masterpiece. There was complete silence after he finished playing. Paul then blurted out, "That was absolutely brilliant." John replied, "I've bought a demo tape of the song with me too," and then offered to play it for them. The others had no need to listen to it. They were so blown away they wanted to record it immediately. For the session, John had had a Mellotron shipped to Abbey Road from his Weybridge mansion. The Mellotron was a strange piano instrument which had tape loops of individual instruments built into each key. In fact, one key when held down played a flamenco guitar which was later used for the opening of the continuing story of Bungalow Bill. John owned one of the first Mellotrons made. Musicians at the time were threatened by the instrument. They felt the built-in tapes could see them obsolete. The recording of Strawberry Fields on this day was the version used at the end of the 6th episode of the Beatles anthology. Very different from what it would later become. The song was complicated to record. The whole time that day, they recorded just one take. As the Strawberry Fields sessions continued, it became clear John was not happy with how the song was sounding. It had started off light and dreamlike when he played it acoustically. Now, it seemed to have lost those qualities. Either way, they continued recording, finished, and mixed the first version of Strawberry Fields Forever. It was put aside to listen to later. Copies were made for the Beatles to listen to at home. After that, they began work on Paul's song When I'm 64. It was a song that dated back to when they played clubs in Hamburg. It was so familiar to the group, the backing track was laid down in just a few hours. Paul wanted to get a certain sound for the song, and George Harrison suggested they use clarinets. Geoff Emerick mic'd them so closely they became a focal point of the song. When Paul recorded his vocals, he asked Geoff Emerick to speed up the tape so his voice would sound more youthful. He wanted to recreate the sound of a younger him singing. At this time, Ravi Shankar was in Abbey Road recording for his album. The problem was, no classical engineer had recorded a sitar before and they were having trouble. When George Harrison was told, he immediately asked Geoff Emerick if he could help. After assessing the situation, Emerick suggested the engineer use a different microphone and place the mic much closer, inches away from the sitar. It worked perfectly and the Beatles continued with Pepper. At this point, John had been listening back to the mix of Strawberry Fields and he wasn't happy. The problem was, he couldn't explain the sound he wanted to George Martin. Paul interjected and suggested they add an orchestral arrangement. John loved the idea, and George Martin got to work writing one. In the meantime, the Beatles decided to start the song over. George Martin took the night off, and the Beatles continued working without him or Geoff Emerick remaking Strawberry Fields. While making the track, they strived for perfection and spent over 30 hours working. They spent more time on this track than any other previous. As they were now 10 days away from Christmas and talking about the turkey dinners they were planning, John sang Cranberry Sauce in a comical voice at the end of the track. When they were finished, John decided he wanted the beginning of the first version and the rest of the second version. The problem was, both songs were in different keys and different tempos. The problem was, when you slow down the tempo of a track, it also drops the pitch. Emmerich had to carefully slow down one tape and carefully speed up another. The first track was carefully transitioned to the second. When he listened to the playback afterwards, John was thrilled. He couldn't tell at all that the two had been merged together. At this point, the engineers and George Martin became very aware of how much time they were taking on the album. People in Abbey Road had noticed it too. They had put it down to inefficiency. Next, they began work on Paul's song Penny Lane. Over the year, Paul had been listening to the album Pet Sounds constantly. He now requested a clean American sound for the production of the song. Emmerich, who was used to mixing American records, decided to record each instrument separately to achieve the sound. By doing this, he intended to eliminate any leakage that may be picked up on the microphones. The backing track was just Paul playing piano, and every other instrument was overdubbed. In those days, there was no click tracks used. Paul's timing was just naturally impeccable. Unlike John, Paul knew exactly how he wanted his songs to sound. While he was sitting at home one day, he'd watched a trumpet player on television and decided to incorporate him into the song. David Mason, who was quite famous at the time, agreed to play on the song. When he arrived at Abbey Road, there was no staff notation written out for him. He had nothing to go by. Mason sat waiting with his instrument, while in the control room, Paul hummed out the part he wanted and George Martin wrote down the chords. While recording the song, the problem the engineers now ran into was they were limited to 4-track recording. As the Mamas and the Papas were doing over in California, they decided to bounce the tracks. Unfortunately, due to the number of bounces, some instruments got lost altogether. The engineers and Paul would spend even more time on Penny Lane than they did on Strawberry Fields. When they came to the end, they decided to lose David Mason's ending trumpet, though some versions were released containing the original ending. After the song was complete, George Martin and Brian Epstein decided it should be the Beatles' next long-awaited single. By now, it was January 17th. The Beatles had took a bit of time off during Christmas, but the engineers had worked through. By this point, John and Paul had gotten into the habit of meeting at Paul's St. John's Wood home before sessions. There, they would go through any finishing touches the song needed before heading to the studio. On January 19th, they began recording A Day in the Life. John had only half a song written and couldn't figure out where he wanted it to go. They laid down a backing track for what they already had, but left 24 bars open to finish later. Their assistant Mal Evans took count of the bars, and it's apparently still audible in the final mix.
5, 6, 7, 8.
For the recording, John laid down such a strong vocal, it was all the engineers and George Martin could talk about for hours afterwards. At this point, Paul brought forward an unfinished composition he thought would complete the song. For the vocals, he wanted his voice to sound like he'd just woken up. To achieve this, Geoff Emerick removed a lot of treble and added a lot of compression. For now, they left the unfilled 24 bars for later and took 10 days off. In the days they took off, they would shoot the music video for Strawberry Fields Forever. When they returned to the studio, a new employee named Richard Lush had joined the team of engineers. On first meeting, Paul approached him and said, "Hello, who are you? I don't remember seeing you here before." Nervously, he introduced himself as Richard. Paul then walked up to him, raised his hands and snapped, "Oh yeah, wanna fight?" The engineer at that point realised Paul was joking. In any tense situations, Paul liked to prank people. February 1st, the group began work on one of Paul's compositions. It was unlike any of the previous ones in that they had been laid back and this was more rock and roll. The song was like a cover they'd done on their earlier albums. It was about a fictional group named Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The track took just 2 days to complete. For the song, Paul decided he wanted to play the rhythm guitar and not John. John wasn't bothered by this. Instead, he picked up a bass guitar to play Paul's part. The engineers, knowing John couldn't play the instrument, fed the bass through a DI box instead of plugging it into a bass amp that was mic'd. That way, they could replace it with Paul's playing later. John had never understood DI boxes anyway. He always had a hard time understanding technology. After it was explained what a DI box was used for, he said he wanted his voice recorded that way, which was like saying he wanted to plug his voice into the mixing board. George Martin was originally going to add a solo to the song, but it took so much time, Paul added his own instead. It was not until they recorded this song that they decided the album would be based around it. They next began work on John's song Good Morning, Good Morning. They recorded a backing track and the song sat around until John decided what instrument he wanted added. The song had been inspired by a cornflakes advert Lennon had watched. For now, he put it aside and decided to finish it at a later date. After that, they began work on Paul's song Fixing a Hole. Paul plays harpsichord for the backing track and George is on lead guitar. George had had little involvement with the sessions to this point, and for the song, he played an unusually long solo for the middle 8. At this point, they decided to finish A Day in the Life. For the 24 bars, John had the idea of a sound starting small and building to something huge. Paul suggested an orchestra. George Martin liked the idea, but stated EMI would never pay for a full orchestra just to record 24 bars. Ringo then interjected, "What if we hire half an orchestra and then record them twice?" It turns out that's exactly what they did. When the orchestra was booked, they went through how they wanted it to sound. Paul stated, "I think it would be great if we ask each member of the orchestra to play randomly." George Martin snapped, "Randomly? That would just sound like a mess. It's pointless." Paul changed his request and asked the orchestra start on the lowest note and build to the highest. John agreed and added they should start quiet and get louder and louder. Inundated with these requests, George Martin replied, "The problem is, you can't ask classical musicians of that caliber to improvise and not follow a score. They'll simply have no idea what to do." As a solution, John suggested they wear silly hats and party noses, suggesting that'll loosen them up. John figured a party-like atmosphere would get them into the spirit of things. He wanted to tear down the barrier between classical musicians and pop groups. Paul also suggested they use the orchestra at the end of the song. He also insisted the recording be an event of friends and everyone should come in fancy dress. John agreed and insisted George Martin and the engineers be in fancy dress also. George Martin responded, "Well, I can certainly ask the orchestra to wear their tuxedos, but at a cost." John then snapped, "Sod the cost. We've made enough money for EMI. They can spring out for it and pay for party favours too." John then began listing off items to Mal Evans to purchase at a novelty store. The session would take place in Studio 1. It was the only place big enough to fit the orchestra and the guests comfortably. On the Friday night of February 10th, the musicians arrived all wearing tuxedos. George Martin was also wearing one himself. Mal Evans had placed balloons all around Studio 1. He began handing out party noses and hats. The classical musicians were taken aback. One of them even slapped Mal's hand away. At this time, classical musicians had a disdain for pop artists. David Mason, who was there for the session, smoothed things over, telling the musicians, "It's just a bit of fun, just go along with it." After this, the guests began arriving. Among them were some of the Rolling Stones, Donovan, Graham Nash. Brian Epstein was also in attendance that day. Neil Aspinall kept a close watch over the crowd to spot any gate crashers. Inevitably, a few were removed by security. As the classical musicians noticed the cameras around, they began asking if they'd be paid extra for being filmed. When told no, they got into a huff. One of them even left in anger. The Beatles had also agreed to dress in tuxedos for the event, but when the time drew closer, they decided against it and turned up wearing their usual attire. That day, the Beatles were required to play nothing. The three except Paul would spend the whole time socialising. George Martin at this point began instructing the orchestra on the plan. The problem was, they didn't seem to like the idea. Paul was overseeing everything and he began explaining to them all he wanted was for them to improvise. George Martin added, "Not completely improvised, there will be a score and there will be conducting, but we need each musician to play on his own without listening to the others." The musicians really didn't like the plan. Eventually, Paul got bored and walked away, telling George Martin, "You sort it out." George Martin, by this point, was becoming very annoyed himself, annoyed with the musicians who were putting up resistance. Still, they agreed to do as instructed. As recording began, the red light went on and everyone in the studio was told to keep quiet. George Martin recorded the orchestra several times, not telling them each time was recorded on different tracks, but convincing them it was just another take. As the evening went on, Paul decided he wanted to conduct the orchestra. As Paul conducted, he implored them to play more freeform. Meanwhile, John wandered around the party in a daze. After the orchestra had gone, Paul decided he wanted to try an idea for the ending of the song. He asked the guests to all hum along to one note. Nothing ever did come of this recording. It never made the final mix. The ending for A Day in the Life would be a massive single piano chord. They also at this point agreed the song would finish the album. By midnight, all was done and they listened to the playback in the control room. George Martin, in truth, was relieved it was all over and he could go home to bed. Sessions at this time were going late into the night. George Martin often got very tired. At around midnight, he would start to nod off in the control room. Sometimes he'd just leave without even saying goodbye. Following this, they began work on George's first and only song for the album. He'd brought in only a northern song. George Martin and the engineers disliked the song. They thought it didn't go anywhere and was quite pessimistic lyrically. In private, George Martin stated, "I'm disappointed George didn't come up with something better." John disliked the song so much he refused to play on the backing track. Paul, George and Ringo continued without him. In reality, nobody could get into it, not even George himself. That session, they ended early and went home. It's a Northern Song was shelved and not looked at again until they needed tracks for the Yellow Submarine album. When they'd work on a song of George's, there was a relaxed, it doesn't matter attitude. His songs were not seen as at the level of John or Paul's. They were never considered for singles, nor did anyone want to spend much time on them. The fact John or Paul showed little interest in them made George resent the two. On February 17th, they began work on John's song Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. As opposed to George, who never had titles for his songs, John almost always had a title. He also wouldn't take kindly to any engineer who mispronounced it. As take one begins, you hear Jeff Emerick introduce the song before John corrects him on the title.
For the benefit of Mr. Kite, this is take one.
George Martin played harmonium for the backing track with Paul on bass and Ringo on drums. The harmonium required George Martin to pedal it in order to circulate air. After the takes, Martin was exhausted. The next day, John came into the control room with ideas for the song. As ever, he couldn't put it into words what he wanted. He told George Martin he wanted swirling music, stating, I want the sound of a fairground around my voice. I want to feel like I'm in the circus with Mr. Kite and the Hendersons. The inspiration for the song came from a 19th century poster hung in John's house. He wanted the song to bring images of that era. Emmerich suggested cutting up tapes as they did with Yellow Submarine to create the atmosphere. They went through Abbey Road stock recordings and put together some backing. It was added to the very end of the song. The song would feature all kinds of overdubs and was worked on for a couple of weeks. At this point, they'd been forced to move to Studio 3. Studio 2 had only been booked for just over a month, and they didn't realise how much time they were going to spend on the album. The studios at Abbey Road were often dark, only lit up by candles and such. In the control room, lava lamps and the glow of the tape machines were the only light source. The late night sessions meant that the Beatles were left without access to food or drink after 10 PM, this being the time the cafeteria at Abbey Road closed. One night, Mal Evans broke the lock on the door in order to get some milk. The next day, management went berserk, but afterwards gave him a key. On the 24th of February, recording began for Paul's song Lovely Rita. For the song, Paul decided to record his bass last. He spent many sessions alone in EMI, with just the engineers recording his part. He put in so many long hours. Emmerich later stated, "Sometimes Paul's fingers will be bleeding from playing." To record Paul's bass, Emmerich decided to experiment with a different technique. He placed his amp in the centre of the studio and placed the mic 5 feet away. It ended up making the bass sound like a lead instrument. For the vocals, Paul told George Martin he wanted the harmonies to have the California sound of the Beach Boys. Harrison attempted a solo, but it never quite worked. Emmerich suggested a piano solo. At that point, Paul asked him to play it. He refused. He was too embarrassed to put his musical abilities up to theirs. It's a decision Emmerich would regret for the rest of his life. In the end, George Martin came down and played it. That day, while they were recording backing vocals for the song, John suddenly announced that he wasn't feeling very well. George Martin got on the control room mic and asked, "What's the matter, John? Is it something you ate?" The other Beatles were amused by this, but John replied, "No, it's not that. I'm just having trouble focusing." The engineers looked at each other, thinking, "That'll be the drugs kicking in then." But George Martin was none the wiser. George then asked if John wanted to be driven home. He replied no in a nervous voice. George then asked him if he'd like to get some air, in which he agreed. John then began walking as if in slow motion. It took him ages to climb Studio 2's steps. He had a glazed look in his eyes. He then looked around the room, apparently searching for something. All of a sudden, he looked up at the ceiling and stated, "Wow, look at that." George Martin then ushered John out of the room, saying, "Come on, John." The engineers had never seen John this intoxicated in a session. About 5 minutes later, George Martin returned to the control room alone. When the other Beatles asked where John was, he replied, "I left him on the roof looking at the stars." Paul and George then bolted up the stairs, knowing full well John had just taken LSD. They brought him down to the studio and arranged for a car to drive him home. 4 days later, they began work on John's song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. At this point, John's personality had changed. He was quite happy for other people to do the thinking for him. In other words, he didn't want to lead the Beatles anymore. The group were also turning up to sessions later and later. Sessions were booked for 7 PM, but you wouldn't normally see a Beatle until around 11. Each vocal take for Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, John's voice became more relaxed and dreamlike. George's lead guitar was also fed through an organ speaker, as they'd done with John's voice on Tomorrow Never Knows. John, during these sessions, requested they try out his previous idea of swinging upside down from the ceiling to record his vocals. Mal Evans was sent out to get a long length of rope to tie him. After hours had gone by, he came back empty-handed. It didn't matter though, John had completely forgotten by that time. Next, of George's song. Nobody was expecting much, and nobody thought much when he brought in Within You Without You. The other Beatles and George Martin were not impressed when George strummed the song out on acoustic guitar. There was actually a big sense of relief when the track turned out so well. For the song, George Martin and George Harrison decided to have a group of Indian musicians record the backing track. As George coached the musicians through the track, John and Paul talked to a famed artist about the album's cover. Afterwards, Paul would come over and have a look at how the musicians were playing. He himself would later buy a sitar. John was not sure how to contribute, so he ended up wandering around looking bored. George concentrated a lot on the sound for the song. The presence of the Indian musicians made him feel comfortable and happy for the first time in the sessions. On May 30th, work began on the inevitable Ringo song. It was late by the time the Beatles all arrived. Despite this, they were all alert and ready. They laid down backing tracks for the song Badfinger Boogie, later retitled With a Little Help from My Friends. Ringo recorded the vocal late after a long session. He was tired and only got through it with the encouragement by the other Beatles. The last note of the song he had particular trouble with. After a few takes, he finally got the note, to which the other Beatles cheered. Next, they began work on Paul's final song, She's Leaving Home. The backing track consisted of a string section George Martin conducted. As he did, Paul sat in the control room relaying orders. For the vocal, John and Paul sat in a dimly lit studio too. Paul pushed John over the lines until they sounded perfect. Their voices were so different sang together that Emmerich had to do a lot of tweaking to make John's voice blend perfectly. The final song they recorded was the reprise of Sgt. Pepper. It was recorded in Studio One. The engineers created a smaller room with screens inside Studio One so the instruments wouldn't pick up too much reverb. The song ended up sounding unlike any other on the album, and that can be attributed to the room in a room technique. The mixing process of the album was complicated. The faders and EQ had to be changed for each instrument recorded. The echo chambers behind Studio 2 enriched the vocals. In fact, on a side note, most plugins today are based on sounds people like Jeff Emmerich created in the 60s. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was released May 26th. The Beatles were now in a friendly rivalry with Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. Two groups with polar opposite recording styles. For the most part, the Beatles recorded backing tracks and added overdubs. Brian Wilson recorded a multitude of orchestral musicians, then had the Beach Boys add complex jazz and harmonies. Basically, Wilson had recreated Phil Spector's Wall of Sound and augmented it with more complexity. In truth, the two groups are incomparable, both revolutionary, both bands inspired by the other. They both had abandoned the standard pop formula. They'd stopped trying to make songs and now tried to make art. Two big changes in the recording process between Revolver and Pepper were the Beatles now had no deadlines. They were free to work as long as they wanted. The second was the time of the sessions. They would now barely even start recording until 7 PM. They'd partied late into the night and slept late into the day. If Revolver had been their sonic masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper was the album that legitimised pop music as an art form.